Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. So, tonight we have Monday Night Football on October 13th. We have a doubleheader with Buffalo at Atlanta, as well as Chicago at Washington. I think I'm going to split these up into two different videos. So, I'm just going to cover Buffalo at Atlanta in this one, and then I'll have a second one where I cover Chicago at Washington. And if we look into the details of this matchup, you have Buffalo favored on the money line with a spread of 4.5 points and a total line of 49.5 points. Buffalo's rankings are pretty high with a passing rank of 2 and a rushing rank of 2. They have an allowed passing rank of 5 and their worst ranking of an allowed rushing rank of 31. So Buffalo is the second best offensive team basically between all of these. But interestingly, they're one of the worst teams at stopping the rush. For Atlanta, you have a passing rank of 5, a rushing rank of 3, an allowed passing rank of 1, and an allowed rushing rank of 22. So Atlanta is right now, based on the average passing yards that they allow, they're the best team at stopping the pass. They also have pretty good offensive rankings as well. If we look how that compares to the actual average numbers, you get 249.8 passing yards on average per game for Buffalo and an average of 154.4 rushing yards per game. They've had a total of 2 passing interceptions this season, and on average they suffer 1.6 sacks. For Atlanta, you have 236.7 passing yards per game and 136.5 rushing yards per game, with a total of 3 interceptions this season, and on average suffer 1.2 sacks per game. If we look at how the defenses do, Buffalo allows 167.4 passing yards per game on average, and they allow 145.6 rushing yards per game. Manages to stop teams with 150.5 average passing yards per game, and on average they allow 109 rushing yards per game. Buffalo averages just under 5 QB hits per game. Defensively, they've had 2 interceptions, and they average 2.6 sacks per game. Atlanta also averages just around the same number with 2.5 sacks per game. Atlanta also averages around that same number with 2.5 sacks per game, and they get 5.75 QB hits on average per game, and they've had 3 defensive interceptions this season. And then going into the quarterbacks for this game, you have Josh Allen for Buffalo, and you have Michael Penix Jr. for Atlanta. Josh Allen has 117.9 fantasy points this season, which is an average of 23.5 fantasy points per game. Michael Penix has 51.8 fantasy points this season, for an average of almost 13 fantasy points per game. Josh Allen has had 2 interceptions on the season, with 8 sacks suffered, and he's had 1 rushing fumble. Michael Penix has had 3 interceptions, suffered 5 sacks this season, and has no other turnovers. So one of the things I want to add is a ranking of how many sacks have been suffered. I think that speaks to the offensive line and their ability to protect. So I think that is an interesting statistic that we can pull out of this number. But looking at the averages, you have Josh Allen with an average of 243.4 passing yards per game and an average of 42 rushing yards per game. Michael Penix averages 229.5 passing yards per game and a little less than 8 rushing yards per game. Just looking at our highs and lows, Josh Allen's low was 148 yards in week 2. His high was in week 1 with 394 and has stayed above 200 otherwise. Michael Penix had his worst week in week 2 with 135 passing yards. His best week was week 4 with 313 passing yards. He also had a good week 1 with 298, but in Carolina he only got 172. Our running backs for this matchup are James Cook on Buffalo and Bijan Robinson on Atlanta. Cook has 83.9 fantasy points this season, 95.9 in PPR. That's an average of 16.8 fantasy points per game, or 19.2 in PPR. Bijan has 70.4 fantasy points this season, 88.4 in PPR, for an average of 17.6 fantasy points, or 22.1 in PPR. There's been no turnovers given up by either running back. And James Cook averages 90 rushing yards per game and 17.8 receiving yards per game, while Robinson averages 78.5 rushing yards per game and 67.5 receiving yards per game. Week by week, that comes out where James Cook's worst week was week 1 with 44 rushing yards. His best week was right after that with 132 rushing yards, where he also had a couple games after that with 100 plus rushing yards, and came back down last week with 49 rushing yards. Robinson's best week was week 2 with 143 rushing yards, and his worst week was week 1 with 24 rushing yards. And otherwise he stayed right about that 70 mark. But one of the other big notes from Bijan is how much receiving he does, with week 1 having 100 receiving yards, and last week having 106, with his lowest being 25 receiving yards in a game. Going into the number 1 receivers, you have Keon Coleman for Buffalo and Drake London for Atlanta. Coleman has 32.6 fantasy points this season, 53.6 in PPR. That's an average of 6.5 fantasy points per game, or 10.7 in PPR. Drake London has 30.9 fantasy points this season, 54.9 in PPR. That's an average of 7.7 fantasy points, or 13.7 in PPR. Both receivers have given up 1 turnover. And if we look at the average, Coleman gets 45.2 average receiving yards per game, and Drake London gets 67.2 average receiving yards per game. That average is really brought up from week 4 with 110 receiving yards, which has been his best week so far. And his worst week was 49 receiving yards in week 2. And otherwise, he had 55 in both other games. For Coleman, his best week came in week 1 with 112 receiving yards. But otherwise, he stayed around that 20, 26, 23. And otherwise, he had 45 in week 4. Despite that, he does get the largest air share of the team's yards, as does Drake London for his team. And finally, looking into our tight ends, you have Dalton Kincaid for Buffalo and Kyle Pitts for Atlanta. Kincaid has 46.7 fantasy points this season, 66.7 in PPR. That's an average of 9.3 fantasy points a game, or 13.3 in PPR. Kyle Pitts has 26.5 fantasy points this season, 46.5 in PPR. That's an average of 6.6 fantasy points, or 11.6 in PPR. There's been no turnovers given up by either tight end. And we have some similar averages between the two, with Dalton Kincaid having 57.4 average receiving yards and Kyle Pitts getting 51.25 average receiving yards. Week by week, Dalton had his best week last week with 808 receiving yards. His worst week was right before that with 28 receiving yards. And he's kind of stayed somewhere in the middle, 66, 37, 48. And with all of that, he does get a pretty decent share of the team's receiving. With Kyle Pitts, you have his best week in week 4 with 70 receiving yards, and his worst weeks have been 37 and 39, and that gives him about a 15% share of his team's receiving yards. So there you have it. That's the pregame numbers for Buffalo at Atlanta. I hope that was somewhat informative, and if so, leave a like and subscribe. Leave a comment if there's more that you want me to cover, and otherwise I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.